Hello, welcome everyone to the Ask Me Anything panel for the aggregation pipeline. I'm Paul Down, I'm a solution architect at MongoDB. Been at MongoDB for about 8 years now, and as you can probably tell, I'm from the UK, so I'm based in London. Asya, why don't you introduce yourself?
I am definitely not from the UK, and that's why I don't sound anything like Paul. I'm based in New York City, although hopefully we'll get to travel again, in which case I'll be based wherever all of our users are, because I love talking to users. I've been with MongoDB for a very long time, and aggregation is my favorite feature. Nick, how about you?
It's definitely in my top 5. My name's Nick. I'm a senior engineer on the query team here at Mongo. So a lot of my work is deep in the aggregation pipeline. I joined about 4 years ago now. I'm also based in New York. So excited to get started here.
Great, thanks Asya and Nick. We're actually getting questions in already, so we've got one that's just come in. So Asya, I think this is definitely one for you. So Asya, can you help me understand what the difference is between MongoDB's query language and aggregations?
All right, so I assume that the question is, why would I use find in some cases and aggregate in other cases? And some of that is a bit historical. Find was the simple kind of CRUD-ish way that you do a query, and it allowed you to specify a query predicate, a projection to specify which fields you want back, and then whether or not you want to sort or a limit or a skip. And that was pretty much it. And aggregation was the more complex, group things by that. But the way we built the aggregation to be a pipeline, it actually could do a lot of things. And you could do an aggregation that was the equivalent of find. In fact, under the hood, if the aggregation is the equivalent of find, it's just going to run the find code, right? Because we didn't want to have multiple different places where the exact same code that did a find equivalent would be. And so when I gave a talk about aggregation like 2017, 2018, I forget now, I actually made stickers that said aggregate is the new find. And that's because aggregate can do everything find can do, but it can also do a whole lot more things. But we don't want to make your existing applications that use find break. So, find is still find. Aggregate includes find, but it also includes all these other things. Eventually, I guess we're going to have to figure out how to streamline things so you never have to think about what do I choose. You just go, maybe we'll call something new that's going to be supersede everything. Maybe we'll call it select. What do you guys think? Nah, that's already been done.
It's actually, yeah, I think that's good info, Asya. I guess probably the follow-on question, putting words in the questioner's mouth, is where would you use aggregations where you shouldn't use finds or can't use finds, for example?
Well, find doesn't allow you to do a group by, right? So anything that requires aggregating multiple documents into some other documents, right? There are also things that you might want to do like a dollar lookup, right? A graph lookup, or dollar out, right? Where you want to output a dollar merge, output the results of a query into another existing collection. You can do a find, but the only way to redirect that find into another collection would be to bring the results back to the client and then push them into a new collection, right? And if instead you use agg to do the equivalent of that find, you could then do a dollar out at the end or a dollar merge, right? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that makes sense. So go on, Nick.
The pipeline language is very extensible, which is part of the reason there are many features like this that exist in it that we chose, in some way or another, chose not to add to the find command language.
Yeah, it makes sense. And actually, we're getting some more questions coming in, but just to remind everyone that's watching here, if you do want to ask questions live, please start putting them in now. So in the Q&A tab that you see in front of you, you can just drop in whatever questions there. Don't worry about spelling or typos. My spelling's not the best here, so please add them in and we'll get to those. So Nick, we got one that's just come in that's probably appropriate to you, actually, given your background. So someone coming in a bit more deeper into the aggregation framework. I see that DollarMatch there is an option to use, but there's also DollarExpert. I don't know how you say the shortened version of the expression. What is this for? Why would I use that instead of a normal filter syntax in DollarMatch? Why would I use DollarExpert?
Yeah, we struggled on the naming on this one. $EXPR, DollarExpert, people call it different things.
Yeah.
The idea is we do have two different expression languages, and DollarMatch is a way of using the filter sort of syntax that you would see in a find command. Now, it is pretty expressive, but there are other things that you can't do that you may be able to do in, let's say, an aggregation expression, which you would use in a projection. So one canonical example that comes up very often is if you want to compare the values of two fields within a document. Our match language doesn't natively support that. So you can use this $expr as sort of like an escaping mechanism to say, hey, I want to use an aggregation expression to evaluate whether some field A is equivalent to B and filter based on that, for instance.
Just a little bit more richer, but maybe a little bit more verbose, I guess, it's probably a good way of summarizing it.
Yeah, it's a good way of summarizing it.
Cool. Asya, one's coming, I think it's good for you. So a question here from the viewers. Are there best practices that should be considered for aggregation pipelines with regards to performance?
Oh, absolutely. And some of them are absolutely no different than what you should consider for all of your other operations, right? Whether you're doing queries or find or update, right? Or aggregation. If you're accessing a small subset of documents in a collection, you want to make sure that you're using an index, right? So if your aggregation starts with a match, only a subset of documents for this customer ID related to this type of whatever, right? The more selective an index is used, the more targeted the query will be, the less unnecessary data it will need to look at. And here I use the word query and aggregation very much interchangeably, right? So just like everything else in databases, if you use an index, things will be faster than if you have to look through a large collection looking for a subset of documents that are necessary, that are necessary for your aggregation. Now, if you are doing some aggregation that requires looking over every single document, for example, you want to know an average of something across the entire collection, an index isn't really going to help you because an index is like a table of contact, right? It's to be able to look up or like an appendix or index in the back of a book. It's you want to look something up and see that it's on a particular page, right? If you have to look at every single page, looking in the index doesn't really help you, right? You may as well just leaf through all the pages really quickly. So there are some cases where inherently, if the operation can't be very efficient because you have to look at like billion documents, then you might consider materialized views, right? A way of creating the summary up front that you can then refresh every few seconds or however often you need to. In general, the approach is like, what is this aggregation pipeline trying to do? How fast does it need to be? And which parts of it can we make faster? And, we have our course, the Practical Aggregations ebook that Paul has written, our docs. They all go into a lot of discussion about how the pipeline gets optimized, what you can do to help the pipeline execute faster. That's pretty much that.
Great, thanks, Asha. And while you're on the subject of the book, there's a question coming here, which I can probably quickly take there. So there's a question that's come in that's around, is there a way to batch populate on-demand views using $merge for a large collection to maybe help reduce memory usage? And so, as you mentioned, the book, Practical MongoDB Aggregations book. So if people Google that, they will see a chapter in there called Incremental Analytics. But essentially what that's doing is saying you've got data coming in day after day and day, and each day or each hour, whatever increment you want, you can run the last mile of analytics to update that view. So that's quite a powerful capability that came with $merge a few releases ago. So check that out in the MongoDB aggregation, Practical MongoDB Aggregations book. Nick, another one coming in for brand performance, probably more for you on this one, and sort of related back to whether you use aggregations or MQL or finds. So the question was from one of the viewers, are aggregation pipelines equal in performance as a find query, so they're replaceable if you like, or should you prefer a find query when possible?
Yeah, I think if this question came up a few years back, maybe the answer would be different, but at the moment, it's, as Asya mentioned, the execution code is now identical. So the reason you would prefer to write your queries in aggregation would be something like if you want to extend them in the future, if something comes up. That's one reason I could see using aggregation. Find might be a little bit simpler. It might be more familiar. So it might take a little bit of a hurdle to jump to the aggregation side of things. But yeah, at the moment, if you can express something in find, you can express it in aggregation so that it's identical.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Nick. And actually, just another nice one for you there, just sort of related. Can I get execution stats with aggregations like I can with MQL and a find? Explain planner. I think the question's around.
Yeah, you can. And I forget which version it was. Maybe Asya knows off the top of her head. We added per stage execution stats as well. So
4. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of useful information in there. I think some of the explaining in a sharded cluster, there might be some quirks there that we have to work out. But yeah, I know the per stage execution stats is definitely something useful that was added.
Yeah, I'd say it's invaluable nowadays. Yeah, absolutely.
And it should support the same verbosity levels that you would specify to the find command.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Asya, one for you here has just come in. So why is $search, and actually as a reminder to everyone, we have, when you're running MongoDB in the cloud, in MongoDB's database is a service called Atlas, you have the capability to use Atlas full text search as well, and that's embedded into the aggregations. So the question is related to that. Why is $search, why is it that $search cannot be added as subsequent stages in a pipeline, and is only limited to the first stage of the pipeline?
Yep.
Asya?
Yeah, so here's this is actually related to something I said earlier about using match at the beginning of the pipeline with an index. And I noticed that there's also a question that somebody asked about, why are we calling it a pipeline, right? So I may as well just summarize that here at the same time, right? In an aggregation, you specify stages one after the other, kind of in order, like a pipeline, similar to a Unix pipe, right? Where a file, let's say you say cat file to grep, and the result of that goes to awk, and the result of that goes to sed, et cetera, et cetera. Same way here, the stages could be something like match the subset of documents we want, and then it goes into a group them. Now match of the results only these, and then transform or something, or pull in some other data, et cetera, et cetera. So there's this pipeline. The pipeline happens in memory, right? What goes into the pipeline, either the entire collection, or if your first stage filters or limits the number of documents that you want to consider in the rest of the pipeline, it can use an index. What is $search? $search says use a special text index, a Lucene index, to only send into the rest of the pipeline the documents that I care about, the documents that match a phrase, a prefix, whatever it is, the search that you're actually doing. So how could it possibly work later in the pipeline? So let's say you have things coming out of group, and you say, okay, now I want to do some kind of a text match on the results of this group. But we never could build an index on that, right? So anything that relies on an index that was built before the aggregation could run, geo index, a regular compound index on regular fields, a search index. Any of those things can only happen once, and it can only happen first. Because otherwise we're just doing an in-memory scan looking at text strings, and that's not going to be any faster. The whole reason to use Lucene indexes is to make full text search very fast. So that's why it has to be first.
And full text search being all about indexes or inverted index, that's the trick it pulls, has to be first. Yeah, great.
Yeah, because we have to use an index that was already built, right? We spent a lot of computing power building that index so the lookup can be fast.
Ahead of time. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah. Great. And actually, you talked about aggregations and pipelines, and it's a good question that someone's come into. We've probably made too many assumptions here, Asya, so maybe for you as well. Someone that's new to this terminology, I understand the aggregation side, but what are you defining pipelines as? What are pipelines?
Right. Well, this is the thing that I just said at the beginning of that answer, right? The pipeline is a bunch of stages that the aggregation, that the collection documents flow through, right?
A set of instructions.
Yeah, kind of, right? But again, like and sorry if I'm old school and most people don't use the Linux command line much, right? But it's just like a Unix pipe, right?
Mm.
Piping the results of one command to the next, except here it's stages, right? The output from match goes into unwind, and the output of that goes into group, and the output of that goes into the next thing, et cetera, et cetera. Our docs, both, we have a lot of presentations about aggregation that show it visually. Visually is probably a lot easier to understand than, me waving hands left to right, which I'm not even sure, does that even show up as left to right for you guys, or do you see the other version of it? So anyway, yeah, so that's why we call it a pipeline, right? Because documents flow through stages and get processed and transformed in order.
Yeah, if we can, it will be streaming, right? Like there are some stages that we have to just look at the entire collection. If you're grouping, if you're sorting or something like that. But in many cases, we can stream documents out as we're reading them. So.
Great. Actually, we've got one coming in around let me just find this one again. So
is it about the batching and the merging?
No, we've got one around. Actually, yeah. Do you want to read that one out? Let me just.
Or do you want to do that? Well, how about this? There's a couple of questions about DollarMerge. So DollarMerge is a relatively recent feature that was added in 4.2. I mean, 2 years ago. It seems like a long time, but it's relatively recent because sometimes it takes a while for folks to upgrade to the latest. And DollarMerge allows you to output a result of an aggregation pipeline into an existing collection, specifying how you want these things to merge into existing documents if they match up. And one question, which is actually a really good question, because I'm going to be like, Nick, why haven't we added anything better here? Is there a way to determine if the aggregation ran successfully when using $merge without having to query the collection you just merged into? And the fact is that if you think about it, an aggregation, it's an aggregate command, right? And it returns, success or failure, and it returns a cursor with a batch of documents. But when you're doing $merge or $out, there's nothing that's being returned. In other words, you're saying, I don't want the data back. I want the data to go into that collection. And now there's not really a mechanism that we have to return the result of exactly what happened back to the user. So is there a way to determine? Sure, I suppose you could look in the logs, and if your logging, is verbose enough, you can tell. But why don't we have something like in Unix where you can look at the status of like a previous command or something like that? Wouldn't that be kind of cool if you could be like command, get previous commands details, and it'll tell you, like I processed this many documents and I wrote this many documents and I returned 0, which is correct because you didn't ask me to return anything.
Well, I feel like this question is leading towards if one of the writes as part of the $merge failed, how would we know? Is that what the?
Well, no, because actually that's the thing about it. If there's an error, we're going to return an error to them. But what if there was no error? What if it was successful? How do you know that it wrote something and how many documents it wrote? I'm actually making fun of things a little bit because I believe I'm the one that filed a JIRA ticket that said, provide a way of seeing how many documents were actually updated or written, as part of merge. Because when you do an update, you get back that result. When you do an insert, you get back like an N inserted, right? When you do a query, you just get back a whole bunch of documents. So like this one's kind of falls in between the cracks, doesn't it? I'm playing devil's advocate.
A good feature request.
Cool. There's one coming here that maybe I'll take. So a question's coming. How can I join multiple aggregation pipelines together and use them independently at the same time, or maybe with another join to combine them? So, yeah, we talk about this in the practical MongoDB aggregations book, but essentially aggregation pipelines are very composable and you define them at runtime. So it's not like having a stored procedure in the database where you define once and then how do you reuse that as part of a larger stored procedure. So from your client application that's issuing the aggregation, whether it's written in Java, Node.js, Python, whatever. You're assembling at runtime in your application code what you want that pipeline to be. And it could be 3 stages here. You could have another pipeline 2 stages, so you can compose one before those 5 stages. But you can take that further. So people might not be aware that you have views in MongoDB. So you can define a view on maybe a collection that filters out some of the records, filters out some of the fields. And a view is defined by an aggregation sort of ahead of time. Now, often what you might be doing is saying, I want to run a further aggregation against that view to sort of filter down some of the records before going into that view. So essentially, you're defining an aggregation against a view rather than an aggregation against a collection. And that's one way you may be assembling, basically bringing 2 pipelines together. It talks about joins as well. We have joins with $lookup. There's probably some more nuances to that question. So I'm happy if people want to follow on there and come back to some of that. And Asya, I think you've probably got a comment.
Yeah. Actually, so even though they say in the question, like, how can we join the results to combine them? I actually think that sounds a lot more like what you mean is union, right? So the equivalent of SQL union, the $union with, which was new last year as well in 4.4. You can actually have multiple independent pipelines on different collections, and you can union their results so you get back a single cursor with all of the results, or you can then group them together, even though they came from 2 completely different collections or something like that. If you want to run different pipelines on exactly the same input, then that could be $facet. And this is why sometimes some of these general questions were like, depending on your use case, it could be this, or it could be that other thing, or it could be this third. It's a very flexible aggregation. Syntax is very flexible, and there's a lot of possible ways of handling data, joining and unioning and splitting and doing different things with it. So take a look at, ask more specific questions, take a look at the docs. All of those can definitely help. Oh, Paul, you are muted.
I'm so sorry. One coming in, that's probably good for you as well, Asya. So there are various stages in an aggregation pipeline, as people know, and a couple of them are $bucket and $bucket auto. And I have to agree, actually, they can be a little bit confusing. So the question is,
when would you use bucket or bucket auto?
Yeah, when would you use bucket, like, and when would you use bucket auto? What do they do essentially, and what would be the difference?
Yeah. Hey, Nick, just out of curiosity, did you work on that? Wasn't that like, I know we introduced them around the time you joined.
Bucket auto or?
Yeah. Bucket or bucket auto?
You mentioned union. I worked on union. Bucket was already a thing.
Okay. Yeah. So bucket or bucket auto are kind of, they're not really syntax sugar because they do some stuff that would be really hard to do otherwise. Bucket actually is syntax sugar. They do a $group, but they give you more simple syntax when you're grouping on something numerical and you want to bucket things. Like, let's say I'm grouping by age and I want to group by, I don't want to group by my age. I don't want to group and see 22-year-olds, 23-year-olds, 24-year-olds. That's not useful. I want to see everybody who's in their under 20, in their 20s, in their 30s, in their 40s, in their 50s, and 60 and above. And to write that out in an aggregation, you'd have to essentially create like a virtual field that, you'd be like, given somebody's age, map it to this range and then group by that range. Or you can use bucket. In bucket, you just give it boundaries. I want to create buckets because we're assuming it's numerical. And you just tell us where the boundary would be. And then the rest of the grouping is done, same way as with $group. Bucket auto is the same thing, but when you don't know what the number ranges are, you just say how many buckets you want and roughly how you want the data distributed. And there's actually some very fancy specialized mathy things that you can look up in the docs where, you want to group things so that they're equal, where each bucket is equal or where the distribution is. Look it up. There's way too many options. I'm going to forget the funnest one or the coolest one, and then I'm going to be kicking myself. So I'm just not even going to name them. Just look in the docs. But they are incredibly useful when you want to group by numerical buckets. is what it is.
Thanks, Asha. We'll get a few questions in the same theme. Just remind everyone, there's the Q&A tab. If you've got questions, we'll probably still got time to answer a few more if you want to put them in live now. We'll get, sorry, Asha, do you have a comment there?
No, I can't believe how fast time is flying by.
I know. It's fun. It goes quick when you're having fun, doesn't it? So
Exactly.
We're getting a few questions around the same theme. So maybe let's try this a different way. It's around what sort of tools, people are saying aggregation pipelines can be hard. What sort of tools do you recommend? And I think it's quite nuanced, and it probably depends on the person. So why don't we go around the three of us? We've all probably got different views here. So Nick, what's your go-to tool when you're building aggregation pipelines?
Yeah, well, I think there's two things here. I think getting it right in terms of writing it in a way that you're getting the results that you expect is one thing, but I think there's a whole other side of it, tooling with getting it right from a performance perspective as well. And this is where I think Explain helps me a lot. On the development side of things, I don't think we have any fancy tooling around pipelines in particular. I think each developer probably has their own sort of strategy there. But yeah, I think Explain for sure is one of those tools that we use a bunch of. And one of the key pieces there is it'll show, like Asya was mentioning, index usage. One of the things we do in the pipeline is perform some sort of analysis over what fields are needed from it. Because of the flexible schema with Mongo, it's pretty difficult to look at a pipeline and say, oh, this thing is actually only referencing A, B, and C. We don't need fields D through Z. But we do have some optimizations in place such that if you're grouping on a field and you're only referencing one other field, we're smart enough where we don't need to funnel in these wide documents through the aggregation pipeline. So there are things like that Explain definitely helps with. It'll show that sort of information. Yeah.
Asya, what are your go-to tools for aggregation pipeline?
Yeah, so actually in the question, somebody made a point that, which is essentially what I do is the trick is to break things up and then compose them together, right? So and some of this I do actually physically in terms of typing, and some of this I just do mentally, right? Is mentally, I first try to figure out like, what do I want and how do I get to that result from the documents that exist, right? Do I just need to transform individual documents? Do I need to group them? And if so, by what? What do I need to compute? What do I need to calculate? And I'm old school, so I use the shell a lot, probably because I developed all my coping techniques before Compass even existed. The Compass Ag Builder and obviously various plugins, like Visual Studio plugin or anything that does any kind of completion and syntax checking is of course huge. But I'm a glutton for punishment. I use VI for any kind of typing. I don't even, use an IDE because I don't write code professionally anymore. So I'm writing code snippets or little test programs or whatever. And so I make all the typos and syntax errors, and then I figure out how to fix them all, how to balance all my braces. The shell does help with that. It does show you like which braces match what, as does VI. And so what I've always done is if I don't immediately get the result that I want at the very end of the pipeline that looks correct, that I got to comment out, the last N stages, and I see what's coming out like, okay, after this group, am I getting what looks correct? Oh, I'm not, because I typoed some field, right? And of course, that's not an error. We just say, oh, this field doesn't exist. Here, you get a bunch of nulls. And Compass, of course, makes it easier because you see the intermediate, like here's what documents look like at the end of every stage. Might have even been my idea because, the UX designers asked me, okay, you write up a lot of pipelines. How do you know that they're working? I go, well, I look at after every stage what's coming out. They go, oh, well, that makes sense. So I'd like to take credit for it. But of course, the UX folks are the ones that get all the credit. And so, yeah, I Explain obviously for debugging. And we did have some offhand mention about streaming versus blocking, the fact that documents stream through the pipeline. And of course, if you don't ever have to block, in other words, if you can just stream the documents all the way to the end and start returning them to the end user, that uses the least resources, right? That uses the least memory. if you're doing like a group early on, or worse, if you're doing a sort without a limit and there's no index to support it, we have to look at every single document before we can get them into proper order and continue streaming them to next stages, right? So how do you limit memory usage? Well, you make sure that you don't use unnecessary blocking stages, that your sorts are supported by index, or that they have limit with them always. And you make sure that you filter things down before you do a group as much as possible, right? You make your group documents, you don't make them unnecessarily large, right? And that will limit the amount of resources that we use, which is part of the optimization, right? Nothing is slower than having to spill to disk, because disk is just so much slower than memory. And of course, memory usage is limited to 100 meg by default, precisely so that you don't basically destroy the availability of your system with one poorly tuned aggregation.
Great, thanks, Asya. So one for you, Nick, that's just come in. Can we parallelize, I struggle to say that word, so apologies. Can we parallelize reading in multiple collections with union with, maybe with something like facet or parallelization to completely, for the aggregation pipeline?
Yeah, we don't do this right now. You could conceptually imagine an execution plan where you parallelize the branches of a union. The closest thing I would say is in a sharded cluster where you have data that's already partitioned. We will, in general aggregation pipelines, that's sort of our parallelization strategy, is we try to do as much work as we can on the individual nodes or replica sets of a sharded cluster without having to pull everything into a single sort of merging node. That's sort of like the 10,000 foot view answer to that question. But yeah, there is definitely some enhancements we could make around union and facet.
Yeah, there is one thing though that I would add to that, and that's careful what you ask for, right? Because if you're debugging and trying to make a single aggregation pipeline faster, of course you go, it would be so much faster if it could use 4 cores or 8 cores, right? And complete that much faster. But in a real production system, you will usually be running thousands of queries and aggregations, or even tens of thousands. What would happen if each one of them tried to grab 4 or 8 cores, right? So the way that our architecture is each operation gets a single processor. But then processors can be, you can have thousands and thousands of them. It's much more common that, the delay is because a query is waiting for a processor to become available because you have 10,000 other queries that are trying to do something. So even though for an individual operation, you're like, oh, but it could take, 10 milliseconds instead of 100 milliseconds. You go, yes, but then it would make every other operation wait that much longer, right? So we're not quite sure that we want to, make it parallelize and be faster at the cost of, the rest of the system becoming slower.
Absolutely. And talking about some of the questions before about tools, there's obviously MongoDB Compass that some people like to use with the aggregation framework, a slightly more GUI way of constructing a pipeline and sort of taking elements out while you're prototyping that. But related to that, there's a question coming in saying, will we be adding the shell to Compass? And the short answer is yes, actually that's just happened. So you might have seen, we have a Mongo shell is a long-standing command line tool for MongoDB. We now have basically a rewritten version of that called the MongoDB shell. It's just been released today, just been announced. That's much easier to use, and with syntax highlighting, lots more autocomplete and that. But that's written in such a way that it's also easy to embed in Compass. That's embedded in Compass as well. So if you download the latest versions of Compass, you get the embedded shell in there and you get the best of both worlds, if you like. I know we're just coming up to the end of the time, so probably I'll go with one last question and probably put both Asya and Nick on the spot here. So putting Nick on the spot because he'd be the guy, one of the people that have to implement it, and putting Asya on the spot because I'm sure she's got a big wish list. So, Asya, aggregation is now quite fully developed. If you could wave a magic wand and ask Nick for one feature in the next release, if it was up to him to implement it and he had the time and resources, what would you ask for him?
Yeah, so this is a kind of thing where, I know how the sausage is made. So I have some wish lists that wouldn't actually make functionally things look any different for you guys and gals. It's that I wish for some things under the hood to work slightly differently or better or be better optimized, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think I have like a stage like dollar merge was my big baby. That was the one that I like pushed and pushed and pushed. And when we finally got it, I was like, I'm so happy now.
We all thank you
Everything
for
else
pushing
are
on
a
that.
whole bunch of little, you know what? I mean, yes, there's lots of little expressions I would love to have, but I don't think there's any big user-facing thing, right? For things to work faster, for things to work better, for dollar lookup and dollar graph lookup to work sharded without bringing your system down to its knees. Of course, yes. But my secret magical wish is something that I'll whisper into Nick's ear so that they can implement it, and all you guys will know is that things will run faster.
It's just the little tweaks and paper cuts around optimizations and stuff like that.
Yeah,
And it's just,
optimizer, yeah, syntax maybe.
yeah, as you say, overall, it's pretty feature complete now. Yeah, great. Okay, well, I think that's it. So thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks, Esther and Nick. A little plug again. So Practical MongoDB Aggregations book. If you search for that, some of the answers will be in there for this. Also, if you're looking for examples, it has examples of aggregation pipelines for different use cases that might help get you going. And good luck on your continuing journey with the aggregation pipeline. Thank you, everyone.
Yay.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.